I don't think any of these are willful decisions on either side to escalate into a full-blown Russia versus NATO war. The lessons of World War I ought to be a reminder that countries sleepwalk into wars that were never calculated at the beginning to be on the scale that they wound up. That's one of my great concerns. And both sides, Russia has a nuclear doctrine that says it reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if they feel they're existentially threat. That's why I say the world would be much better off if this war comes to some sort of a negotiated end.
Yeah, well, we may not love war, but war loves us, right?
Exactly right.
Well, welcome back to the Heroes Path Dispatch. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. 13 days ago, we left you with 10 nights of strikes and a war without an exit. And since then, oil touched $100. The American death toll reached 18. And then this weekend, the president canceled the biggest strike of the war and announced the outlines of a deal. Iran's answer to yesterday was, what talks? Meanwhile, the war quietly reached America's soil through the water systems of 30 small towns throughout the country. And so that's tonight. The Brink, the bargain, and the home front. The so what and the now what, every single story. Jeff Steinberg, it's great to be with you again.
Pleasure, John. Always look forward.
Yeah, there's a lot that's happened since we last talked. So let's talk about 5 quick things. First, a Russian missile came down inside a NATO country this week, and the world barely looked up. Should it have?
We're in a war. Ukraine has been able to incredibly withstand for 4.5 years the vastly superior Russian capabilities. NATO countries have played a decisive role in enabling Ukraine to stay in the fight. There was a deal people may remember back in April of 2022, not a month and a half into the war, that was about to be signed by Zelensky and Putin. And Boris Johnson flew into Kiev and said, we've got your back, unlimited supply of support, keep fighting. And that war has now effectively expanded into enormous support, particularly from European NATO countries to Ukraine, but that support is dwindling. American equipment, even if we're selling it to the Europeans who then pass it along to the Ukrainians, is no longer there. Our inventory is greatly depleted. I think we're at a point where there are reasons both on the Russian and Ukrainian side that this thing ought to come to a negotiated end very soon. Putin's losing a great deal of support internally. The fact that long-range Ukrainian strikes are hitting deep into Russian territory, hitting civilian areas. This is a war that needs a kind of mutual agreement that it's a stalemate and some kind of diplomatic settlement needs to be reached. The U.S. was trying to play that broken role. That's been the subject of a lot of domestic political football fights and never materialized. It was never going to be easy, but Trump sort of lost interest as the Iran thing heated up.
Yeah. Well, 3 developments just in this past week. This fortress city, I have a hard time trying to pronounce it, Kostiantynivka. It held
Something like that.
Yeah, it held for years, but it's a fortress city. It's effectively fallen. One Ukrainian soldier said, we've effectively already lost it. 2 nights later, Russia's biggest barrage in months killed civilians across 10 regions in Ukraine, and one of its cruise missiles crossed into Poland. And that's NATO territory. Polish F-16 scrambled. The probable impact site was found near a village in Lublin. Nobody was hurt, but that's the scenario the planners lose sleep over, isn't it? It's basically something that was probably a test shot by Russia to target Poland, I would say, wouldn't you?
Sure. I think this war has dragged on and the parameters have shifted. Ukrainian drone and other strikes have crossed over some of the NATO territory in order to hit targets that are easier access through those pathways. And the Russians are doing the same thing. What I fear is that I don't think any of these are willful decisions on either side to escalate into a full-blown Russia versus NATO war. The lessons of World War I ought to be a reminder that countries sleepwalk into wars that were never calculated at the beginning to be on the scale that they wound up. That's one of my great concerns. And both sides, Russia has a nuclear doctrine that says it reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if they feel they're existentially threat. That's why I say the world would be much better off if this war comes to some sort of a negotiated end. Maybe somebody could do a Dayton Accords kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, we may not love war, but war loves us, right?
Exactly right.
Well, Jeff, let's talk about the second development. Uganda just effectively beat Ebola with only 20 cases, but then you look next door, Congo is past 3,000 and losing that trail. Same virus, same border. What decides who lives in that?
Uganda has remained a remarkably stable country in that part of Africa and has gone through a certain kind of basic infrastructure improvement. I wouldn't give it high marks by the European or North American standards. But the point is that when you get an outbreak like that, if you've got reasonable stability and certain resources in place to respond, it's very different than when you're in a country that has been unstable and effectively in a low intensity civil war state for a long period of time. It becomes a lot more difficult to get the emergency medical personnel in who know what they're doing to curb the spread.
Yeah.
And
well, the World Health Organization is saying that the true count may be 2 to 4 times higher than.
Sure, it absolutely is. The ability to maintain records, to do any of the confirming tests when you're in that kind of an unstable environment, you can't do it. It's reminiscent of some of the things that happened around Lebanon, Gaza, the other areas where we've seen similar questions about the ability to even judge the magnitude of the casualties.
Yeah, probably people aren't paying too much attention to it because it's an ocean away. But I think the thing that we should pay attention to is that this is the fastest growing Ebola outbreak ever recorded.
That's right.
Same virus, 2 systems, but 2 outcomes, as we just talked about. So, Jeff, let's talk about the third development. Spain just had its largest fire ever, a magnitude 7 earthquake in Japan, and the biggest water cuts in the Colorado River has ever seen. Which one are Americans still living with in 10 years, do you think?
We've talked about the need for infrastructure investment. There's no question that we're going through a tumultuous period of climate change on the West Coast. You've got the El Nino effect that's causing significant heat waves and other problems. All you can do is anticipate and invest adequately in the protective infrastructure. And so when we skimp and save on those kinds of things, we're basically rolling the dice against Mother Nature, and it's never a good idea to do that.
Yeah.
So all of these things are
here at home. This is what matters for us is that you've got a dozen large fires across the interior Northwest. Washington announced its largest water cuts ever proposed for the lower Colorado River, and that effectively hits 3 states, Arizona, California, and Nevada. The reservoirs are at their lowest since 1957, and that story right there is going to outlast every headline in this episode.
That's right.
Because it matters to all of us today.
Back in the 1960s, during the Kennedy period, Parsons Engineering designed a water management system for the western region of the United States, everything west of the Rockies. And it involved construction of canals, dams, capturing a lot of the spring melt from the Yukon Territory in Alaska, capturing that water and running it down to expand overall net fresh water availability. It would have run down from Alaska all the way down into northern Mexico, Sonora region. And Kennedy strongly supported it, but there were local elements in some of those states that just simply said, no, that water's ours. We're not going to share it. And there were long-term anticipations of these kinds of water problems. And when opportunities were presented to invest in solutions, the naysayers said it's too expensive. And besides, we can kick that can down the road for probably another 30 years. And now we're half a century later and the problems have come home to roost.
Yeah.
I've said the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that we've got over $4 trillion in deficit in infrastructure spending to maintain our existing systems.
Jeff, let's move on to the fourth point. This past week, Washington averted a shutdown. You had a spy chief who was seated and a war that's still unfunded. All of those things are happening right in Washington, D.C. as we speak.
Yeah, well, we're in the run-up to to the midterm elections, in my mind, it was a no-brainer that the House and Senate Democratic and Republican leadership were going to come up with a way to delay any government shutdowns until after the November elections. And so what they did was something that Congress has increasingly resorted to, which is a clean continuing resolution. And the reason that the funding for the Iran war was not included in it was because they needed a large majority of Democratic votes to get over the finish line with the clean continuing resolution. We've been increasingly unable to actually pass budgets for the executive branch agencies in any kind of timely fashion. We're winding up increasingly going with these mega bills that nobody has time to read, which basically say, all right, we're going to fund at this level across the board blanket cuts or increases or whatever it's going to be. And it's not real legislation. We're not talking about the things that we really need.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, the fifth one, and you had SpaceX's Starship. It was the largest rocket ever built, and until now, a magnificent source of fireballs. Finally had its day. It carried 20 next-generation Starlink satellites to space, relit its engines in orbit, survived the re-entry, and made what the company called the softest splashdown it's ever had. So that was quite an accomplishment, wasn't it?
Sometimes these things take a lot of failures before you remove all the glitches and
extreme
failures. But I don't think anybody is going to write notes to Elon Musk apologizing for the costs that were incurred. I think it's an important breakthrough, and it's a reminder that in certain frontier areas of science and technology, we still have capability. Yeah. We've got to broaden it, but it's impressive.
Jeff, let's move on now to the main topic. From night 12 to $100 oil, Iran was losing every exchange, but they kept on escalating anyway. What was Tehran trying to prove?
From their standpoint, victory is defined by survival, being able to simply wake up the next morning and have the country relatively intact. And the Iranians are pretty good number crunchers. And I think they know very well, because it's an open secret, that our inventory of air defense capabilities, the Patriots, the THAADs, all of these things are largely depleted. Our cruise missiles, the offensive capabilities are diminishing. And the head of CENTCOM, the head of EURCOM, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been making public statements in the recent days acknowledging that this is a real problem. There's a news report which I find incredible that basically the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, reached out to President Trump and he said, we want this thing not to escalate. We want a de-escalation. It's killing us in many respects.
The Houthis just opened up a second energy front, right?
Exactly right.
They struck Saudi oil facilities on both coasts,
exactly.
tankers in the Red Sea, and then a drone hit a gas ship in the Egyptian port near the Suez Canal. They're pretty dramatic events, so it's not surprising at all to me, and I think that just further enhances the credibility of that report.
Yeah, and apparently what Mohammed bin Salman told Trump was de-escalate or we're going to start selling off our treasury holdings. So it wasn't just simply a request. It was something that carried some significant weight behind it. And I think that's part of the calculus. The energy prices, the depletion of our inventory, those two factors alone say that a major escalation without a clear idea of what the outcome was going to be was really not the way to go.
Yeah. Well, in the meantime, we have 18 dead Americans and 624 wounded. That number just got bigger because somebody at the Pentagon changed a ledger. So give me your reading on that.
Well, I think there's been an attempt to match the data with the president's rhetoric, and that becomes a problem. It's not the first war we've gotten involved in where the numbers were distorted in order to create an appearance of greater success than we were actually experiencing. Vietnam was the gold standard of that, but clearly people in the Pentagon, especially with Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of War, are under a lot of pressure to come up with data that supports statements that the president's making at 3:00 in the morning on Truth Social. I'm sure that there are people in the Pentagon who have been arguing for are presenting the real figures because they're also looking at the inventory depletion and other things that say that this is a situation that really needs to be ended with diplomacy of some kind.
What Tehran is saying that a deal isn't even in the works, but I've got to think that there are some back channel discussions going on. What's your
There's
take
no
on
question. The foreign minister acknowledged today that while there's direct talks, there are extensive talks that are being mediated by Oman. Everybody is on the phone with the chief of staff of the Pakistani Armed Forces and the Pakistani prime minister. So there's no doubt that there are channels back and forth. And so today, for example, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that he believes that we're 24 to 48 hours away from announcing a signed agreement by both sides. The difficulty is that there were factions in Iran that genuinely believe that by that survival standard, they're winning. And you've got people that may be looking to sabotage decisions their own governments have made. Iran's factionally divided on this issue very clearly.
Oh, no question about that. In fact, the hardliners are accusing the elected government of a soft coup, and
against their coup.
And there's protests over inflation, blackouts are spreading, so things aren't too rosy in Tehran right now.
Definitely not. And their biggest fear is people coming out on the streets, not over the war issue, but over the economy. It's become very hard.
Well, Jeff, we talked about this before we came on air. Our intercept capability has been completely expended, hasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we're aware of the problem. The Deputy Secretary of War, Stephen Feinberg, is working with a whole team of people to invest funds in the expansion of our defense production capability. I spoke to a retired four-star on Saturday morning, and he said he's doing a yeoman's job. He's probably really holding things together there, but the lead time to really expand production in a meaningful way is measured in years, not days, weeks, or months.
Yeah. There's another development too, and that is that you had a water plant in Braham, Minnesota, population just 1,200. It went offline, and essentially that was also a casualty of this foreign war. As much as you didn't want to admit it, but Iran hackers have demonstrated that they can hit almost anything. Why did they pick towns that most Americans couldn't even find on a map?
I think that they didn't want to escalate in a way that would force a counter-escalation, but it was a reminder that capabilities exist all around. In this case, they're well aware that they were hit with a massive cyber attack, Stuxnet, back a number of years ago, and it was openly acknowledged that it was a joint U.S.-Israel operation. And Iran is one of the 4 or 5 countries that are among the leading countries who've developed that cyber offensive capability. It's the nature of warfare in this current digital era that cyber is an enormous component of any kind of consideration of warfare.
Yeah.
So
what's scary about this is that, and I think significant about it as well, is that you had 30 towns that were hit simultaneously. And then you had what we talked about several weeks ago with these autonomous AI attacks. They kept on evolving too. Jade Puffer attacker now deploying ransomware built specifically to destroy AI systems. Even one of OpenAI's own models slipped its leash as well. We thought it was pretty limited, but it turned out that it wasn't so limited.
And then a second company announced the same thing happened.
Get ready for more of this because it's definitely going to be coming. The Fed managed to keep rates unchanged, but 3 Fed officials voted to raise those rates. And I think that they were particularly concerned about inflation. Who's right? The ones who voted to raise the rates or the ones who voted to keep it the same?
Kevin Warsh was supposed to be going in there as a loyalist to the president to drive rates down. But you've got to acknowledge that when he got there and started actually accessing the vast amount of economic data that's produced by the 12 regional feds and the headquarters, he said, yeah, inflation is a big problem. June looked pretty good because it was an extended part of the period that you had the ceasefire and the limited opening of the Straits of Hormuz. So let's wait to see what the July numbers say. Clearly, inflation is going to be significantly up. People on Wall Street are betting that there will be actually at least one rate increase before the end of the year. We've got 3 more FOMC meetings between now and New Year's.
Well, if you're carrying a variable right now, or if you're eyeing a loan, I think September is the date that matters because the prices at the register are now, they're carrying a permanent tariff floor.
Right.
So none of this is panic material, but all of it is definitely planning material.
Definitely. And of course, people are looking at the debt peaking just under $40 trillion and the debt increasing, and therefore the debt service when those rates are higher, increasing to where we're spending more on debt service than we are on the Pentagon budget.
Yeah. Well, what are the three things that you would look at for the week ahead? The first one that comes to mind is this deal real? Are we going to be able to see oil being transported through the Strait of Hormuz? Another one is that on Friday, the jobs report comes out, and then you've got everything that's going to be happening in September when Congress comes back. You've got a war powers clock still ticking.
Well, there's a few things I'd point out in the immediate week ahead.
Yeah.
Is the deal with Hamas going to move to the point where they start to disarm? But they're testing the waters on how willing President Trump is to pressure Netanyahu, because they're saying we will disarm and it'll be verified, but we want the Israeli troops to withdraw back to the line that existed during the earlier ceasefire, which still represented control over 50% of Gaza, but they want to see the Israeli troops move back. So it's going to be a battle of will between President Trump and Netanyahu, who's got his elections coming up on October 27th. So that situation, it's not been as much on everybody's radar screen in recent weeks, but it's there, and I think it's going to be a very important test. Secondly, the Senate remains in session until August 11th. They've got a few important business items on their plate. We've gotten through the continuing resolution, but there's a major piece of legislation related to artificial intelligence called the Clarity Act, and that's going to be coming up for a vote in the Senate, and the Democrats are protesting certain ethics elements of that bill. It's kind of inside baseball to go through the details, but if that passes, it will be the first really substantial piece of regulatory legislation over AI. So it's something that may not look sexy, but it's a really important step towards recognition that AI needs to be framed and regulated, and the SEC and the Commodities Futures Trading Corporation and other elements are going to be responsible for that if the bill passes. It passed the House already, and now it's on to the Senate. Also, Todd Blanche's confirmation as Attorney General's up for a vote next week, and he signed a written order shutting down the $1.8 billion kickback fund or slush fund, whatever you want to call it.
The Weaponization Act, right?
Exactly.
Anti-weapon.
A couple of Republican senators basically switched their votes in support of it now based on that demand. So I think we're going to see him get through, because if I was in President Trump's shoes, knowing that there's a reasonably good chance that Democrats will take back the House and start litigating a lot of the scandal material, he really wants somebody who has that background as his personal attorney and his attorney general.
Yeah.
So those are the issues.
Well, also his sons stand to benefit too, because I think that as part of this deal, they won't be subject to an audit, as I understand.
Right. Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
Well,
so a lot happening for a slow August.
The stock market did well today, as I understand it too. So
that's Scott Besson cheerleading that the deal is going to be signed within a day or so and the straits will open.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the Treasury Secretary talked that one up.
Yeah, people believe him still, at least.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, I'll close with this. Twice this summer, we've stood a day away from something much worse, and twice the machinery pulled back. Whether this weekend's bargain is real or it's theater, still 18 families here in the United States already know the cost of finding out slowly. So watch the two numbers with us. Jeff Steinberg, thank you. And to everybody.
I was glad to be here.
Jeff, it's just great to be with you. If we can get together down in West Palm Beach, we'll do that and talk about some future episodes that we're planning.
Very good.
And also, by the way, we're planning another webinar with you. We still have to schedule that as well.
Right, in August. Absolutely.
To everybody listening, hold your people close, ask your town about its water, and keep walking the path with us. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. Thanks for walking the path.